Okay. Here I am with Miss Dr. Charlotte Baker, here to talk about disability and albinism. And our topic today is the atrocities and killings of people with albinism and other disabilities in Africa. So I'm very thankful for Dr. Baker being able to share her time and her knowledge and her expertise. And I just want to say thank you for being on the show, Miss IJ's Kids podcast. It's a small podcast, but we're trying to move mountains with our message. And I just wanted you to come on here and tell me more about yourself. There's so much you've done. I feel like you are a treat for this field in terms of your expertise and your research and critical disability in the field in Africa. And so could you just tell us more about yourself and who you are and what you do?
So my name is Charlotte Baker. I'm a professor of French and Critical Disability Studies in the Department of Languages and Cultures at the University of Lancaster, which is in the northwest of England. I hold a master's and a PhD from Nottingham University. And in my role as an academic, I'm involved in research and teaching, engagement and leadership, as well as administration. So research is part of what I do, but a very important part.
Nice. Wow. That's amazing. Like I was saying, when I found you online and what you do, I was really amazed with how I guess passionate you are with the things that you do, especially in the area of albinism. So as we know, I got into the field because I started out as an special education teacher, and I was doing something else. I had a master's in something else, and then I substitute taught in a class, and I just loved it. And I started getting very interested in people with disabilities in Nigeria because that's where I was born and raised before I went to school. So your area, your focus, your passion is albinism. My question is, why that area? What drew you to that?
Well, it actually came out of my postgraduate studies. For my PhD, I was writing what was a literary study of how albinism was represented in Francophone African literatures.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, this was in the early years of the 2000s, the first reports of attacks on people with albinism started to come out around 2006-07. And I was halfway through my PhD then, and I felt, well, I really can't ignore this. Writing about how people are portrayed is not going to help anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I did continue with that for the purpose of the PhD. But I started to look around for other experts on albinism who were working in the UK and further afield. And I applied for some funding once I'd graduated to bring together experts in the field from across different disciplines, academic disciplines, but also NGOs, charitable bodies, third sector, to think about how we could respond. And this led to an initial meeting at the university, and then a bigger meeting, which we held in Cameroon, where we actually brought the NGOs and albinism associations to the center of that meeting, really.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of creating a more international network.
Wow.
And then since then, I've published more widely on albinism and disability more generally.
Wow. That's amazing. That's my favorite word. You say it amazing, but the reason why I think what you're doing so critical, especially in this time, is that a lot of people, if they're not kind of connected to maybe having someone in their family with disabilities or studying, about, critical disabilities, they may just not know. And I think that we're such a small group of people and we want to bring awareness to it. So if we could describe your research in layman's terms, right? Like, what is it about albinism from your studies and from your experiences that has maybe brought so much atrocities to them, either locally, like in Africa, or just having people understand why this is so important right now in this field?
Well, before I start talking about the beliefs that are associated with albinism, which is the driving force or has been manipulated into being the driving force behind these attacks, what's really important to say is that people with albinism have some really fundamental challenges in their lives. And these are caused by the lack of pigment in their hair and skin and eyes, that albinism causes. So their skin is extremely vulnerable to skin cancer, to sun damage as a result of a lack of pigment in the skin. And because of the lack of medical treatment and support systems, many people with albinism in sub-Saharan Africa will die very, very young as a result of skin cancer. And of course, albinism also carries various levels of visual impairment, and this poses additional challenges. But yeah, to return to your question, in terms of the challenges that people are faced with, many of these stem from the beliefs that are attached to albinism. And these are rooted in different places, in traditional understandings of people with albinism and stories, narratives about albinism, also in religious belief, but also in modern understandings of albinism, contemporary understandings of albinism, which are quite problematic. Not recognizing albinism as a disability, but as a lack, as something that it marks people apart as different in quite a negative way sometimes. So what this means for people with albinism is that they're prevented often from being included in community activities because of the beliefs and understandings attached to the condition. They may be verbally abused in public, bullied. Some children are not allowed to go to school. Others do go to school, but then encounter social exclusion and educational marginalization because they cannot participate, or they're not enabled to participate in that school space. And then at the most extreme end, we find forms of violence that include everything from abductions and mutilations, killings, even infanticide. So there are many issues that face people with albinism. But on the flip side, I have to say, we shouldn't only focus on the negative. There are some brilliant examples of high profile musicians, models, politicians with albinism who are using their very positive visibility to advocate and to influence attitudes in a much more positive way.
Wow, that's amazing. And I like what you said, because we shouldn't just focus on the negative. We have to look at what it is that people who have albinism do. Now, something I noticed with some of your, because I've read some of your publications, which I will be citing in my dissertation, but I read some of your publications, and I know one thing that you are doing is leading the conversation and changing how we talk and address people with albinism. Because I'm Nigerian and I went to high school in Nigeria, and I had friends who had albinism, and we would use the term, and I'm only using it now because a lot of people that I went to school with probably still use that term because they don't know. And so I want this podcast to be a platform to talk about what are those alternative explanations, and you really lead that conversation with that, not using the word albino or albino, but using the word people with albinism. And why is it important in how we address or talk, or just communicate and connect with people with disabilities, especially albinism?
I think that kind of language of using person with albinism, it puts the person ahead of the condition. It recognizes they are a person who, by accident of birth in this case, and their genetic inheritance, will be born with albinism and must live with the consequences of that. And actually, it recognizes that the disability of being born with albinism doesn't stem from the person or from any impairment or lack or inadequacy, but it stems from a lack of accommodation of them within society. So if we return to what I was saying before about education, a child can be very well included in a classroom with some very, very simple but effective adjustments. So a child with albinism has visual impairment, and enabling that child to simply move to the front of the class, but in a part of the classroom where the light isn't disturbing their vision, and maybe providing large print teaching materials or exam scripts, maybe allowing them to wear a hat indoors to just shade their eyes. These simple measures can make an enormous difference.
Absolutely.
And the same for the challenge of skin cancer, that dressing appropriately, covering their skin during the daytime, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. This is all really, really important.
Right.
But this information is not out there as it should be. And therefore, these provisions aren't being made.
Yeah. Wow. You stress such a very important point because as a special education teacher, like in the US, what you're saying are those accommodations and modifications that we make for students with disabilities. And I think this was also part of my desire for the podcast is I would sit in my American classroom and I would see these accommodations and these modifications. And I see students with disabilities learning alongside students without. And that gave me a lot of hope to, okay, how can we help in parts of Africa? How can we make this a reality? How can we help, change our policies so that they can see, like you said, those really simple changes, and also teacher training. Like everything you said right now is a course on its own, like it could be incorporated and teachers can be taught that. But
this is a dream actually that I have, is to put together, even if it's a very short piece about that can be incorporated very easily in this day when technology is much more accessible to people, that is a piece of training on how to include children with albinism in the classroom. And it would be very easy to do. It wouldn't be particularly time consuming or costly. But it just is something I need to get onto. But as a step towards that, we worked with an NGO called Standing Voice, who do a lot of work with people with albinism in Tanzania and Malawi particularly. And they have skin clinics, vision clinics, but they also do a lot of myth busting around albinism and work on education as well. And with them, we put together a booklet for teachers in schools, and they distributed it through their vision program. And the feedback from that, which was quite a small project, but the feedback was incredible from those teachers and all the children who were participating in those schools who had albinism improved their grades from one term to another. That's just amazing. Because the teachers were making these very, very simple changes in the classroom.
That is amazing.
Yeah, this is what we need.
That's see, I think like with the technology, and discovering people like you, it feels like there's a community out there of people who are doing the same thing for the same cause. And with albinism, like looking at the research with the World Health Organization, this is, there's 1 to 500 to 15,000 people from just that research who have it in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a large, small but large group of people who need our advocacy. We need to amplify their voices and do what we can. So I have to talk about something that you were part of that is extremely, my heart just lit up and bursted out of my chest knowing that this is something that has gone to the UN Human Rights Council for doing. And I want you to speak more about it because it is you and a couple of other people in the field who came to the table for a resolution in recognizing people with albinism. And there was some positive feedback from there. And I want you to talk about it because it's huge.
Thank you. Well, I think going back to my role as an academic and that realization I had as a PhD student that sort of studying a subject at a distance just wasn't really doing it for me. I decided that my role as an academic actually could be one of bringing people together and facilitating collaboration and generating interest and consensus ultimately on important issues. And I think that's the thread that's run through my work, really. Yes, I can organize conferences, I can write articles or books, but those who make a change are actually already working on the ground. So that might be for albinism, the associations of people with albinism who are working together already, civil society groups and NGOs, and then governments and international organizations. And so I think that work on the UN resolution was almost a culmination of this collaborative effort, bringing together the right people with a shared vision, and then pushing for it. And getting to the point of the resolution being passed took us around 4 years from an initial meeting where it was a dream to then working with the UN independent expert, who was absolutely brilliant and really driven to achieve this, and with the Witchcraft and Human Rights Network. So yeah, those three partners, and then many other people were involved in bringing this to the table, where it was then discussed and actually supported by the Africa group in the UN Human Rights Council, and supported by other groups as well.
That's amazing. So what can we expect from this resolution that has taken place? What are the good things that we can expect from it from this point forward?
Well, we're now again at the dreaming stage. Having secured the resolution, the work now begins to make things change. And this is going to be several lifetimes' work. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to change anything overnight. But the resolution calls for the elimination of harmful practices associated with what we've termed witchcraft-related beliefs. And that recognizes that believing in witchcraft is not a wrong in itself, but when those beliefs become harmful to other people, including people with albinism, then it's a problem. So the resolution, it highlights laws that are already there often, sometimes former colonial laws that need to be revisited and rewritten and refocused. But it also calls for action on the part of governments to put in policies, national policies, to respond to the attacks on people with albinism, but also those other vulnerable groups. So children, the elderly, people who are accused of witchcraft, for example, to bring about change.
Wow, that's amazing. So your organization that you started is it started in what year, ma'am?
So I started something called the Albinism in Africa project, and it was rooted in an academic project, but it's grown into more of a network, I guess. Wow. And it underpins the current work I'm doing on disability more generally as well.
Wow, that's interesting. You say that you when you say francophone, and this is another thing where I think because now we're located in Germany, but we're in the US, and we try to explain to people that Africa is a huge continent, and we're talking English speaking, we're talking French speaking. And I know that Nigeria borders Cameroon. And it's just good to see that with your academics and your knowledge that we're actually working with other parts of our, sister nations in Africa, who speak French, which is huge, and language is a big thing. And it's good to know that that we're able to reach many parts of Africa, because it's like you said, it's a we thing. It's not just one person and us in the States or in Germany. It's a we thing, because the idea of people with disabilities being seen as human beings first, like you said, you have to put the person first before the disability, is huge. And it's also a very passionate thing for me, because being raised in Nigeria, it's either you pray the disability away, or like you said, it's witchcraft, and then it becomes harm to people. And sometimes it's really just information that many families don't have. So how do you get your research and solutions and support? How do you get it into the hands of local people and families, and people in very rural areas, and like you said, students with disabilities who can't go to school, or mothers who have to carry their child with disabilities to school, and just all these things that I know it's a lot, and like you said, I try not to paint Africa like this really sad place where nothing good happens, but we have to look at all the good that Africa, brings, and all the things that we're still struggling with as a continent in terms of just policy and leadership, and being able to use our resources the best way to help people with disabilities. So how does your organization, Albinism in Africa Project, how do you get this information and resources and support to families on the ground who might need that information? That was a long question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think it's something I'm very conscious of. And also, I don't feel I want to wade in and push aside work that's already been done. As I said earlier, I think a lot of work is already being done on the ground by organizations. Often what I can do is get them to talk to each other more, to collaborate with each other. So I've got a project running at the moment in Uganda. It's a very small sort of seed project, but it's paired up a sort of a startup NGO that's very, very small, working in one small area, with one that's much more long-standing and an international NGO that's providing mentoring. So that's the kind of thing I can facilitate.
Yeah.
And through these organizations, we can feed our research down to them. But also what I've always found with doing what's called engagement work here in the UK, which is working with non-academics, is that a lot of my learning comes up from them. And so it's not just a one-directional process, but it's a collaborative effort, and a genuinely collaborative effort if we are ever going to achieve any change.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is true. I was watching another presentation because I try to learn more about the people I bring on to speak on the show, because in my studies I'm also learning, and I can use what I'm learning for change. And I watched one of your videos on Epilepsy Alliance with Africa. And I was really moved by that, because I think also coining the term alternative explanations is huge. I think we really have to start from a place of empathy first. And I just think that, and I can speak because I'm Nigerian. It's just, like I said, when I went to school, they would use those words on people with albinism, and we didn't know. And it becomes, the norm, and it becomes part of culture. So it's like, it feels like a really huge task, because we're going in to like really, take away all those things that we were raised, on saying and doing. So alternative explanations. Why is this a critical in understanding how to support people with disabilities? Just coming from a place of empathy, especially being somebody who has really learned a lot about our cultures. Why is this important for us as a people, on a local level, or even in the diaspora? Because a lot of us left Africa to, go to the UK or the US to school. How do we help in really changing this narrative and how we explain and talk about people with disabilities and not be afraid of it,
Well, I think that's really key, isn't it? Is being willing to talk about it.
Yes.
And I'm a white woman. I'm based in the UK. I have, I've visited many African countries over the years, and I'm starting to do field work increasingly. But it's always a process of learning. And equally, it might be that a Nigerian has never stepped out of Nigeria, and then is talking about another cultural context that they're equally sort of, separated from. So I've learned not to be afraid of that, but to take it as a way of an opportunity to learn. I would say that with this term alternative explanations, what we're trying to recognize is that there are many explanations for disability, and these might stem from people's assumptions or misunderstandings, or they might stem from stories that they've heard locally, or from religious beliefs, or from medical explanations that say that, your disability is caused by this, and therefore this is what it will mean for you, or from these supernatural or witchcraft related beliefs. And often these intersect with each other. They're often layered. A person with a disability, they may well not encounter any explanation for their disability, so they don't even understand that they're disabled until a particular event happens. Other people actively seek explanation, and they might well go to a medical doctor. So let's return to epilepsy and be told, okay, you have epilepsy, you need to take this medication. But they might at the same time seek the traditional healer to be providing them with a solution or a cure. And then the family at the same time might be talking about them being cursed because they've done something wrong. And so all of these explanations sit alongside each other. Now, what we're interested in is how disabled people deal with these different explanations, what their impact is. But also we want to think at that level of policy and think about, well, how then should NGOs and governments and international organizations talk about disability? Because these explanations are nowhere to be seen in a lot of, reports that are written by NGOs,
Yeah.
or in a lot of the academic literature, or even in policy documents.
Yeah.
So we felt there was something really missing, and that's the gap we've been
Mhm.
trying to fill a bit with this project.
I love that you said policy. That was actually my next question, which wasn't part of our questions, but I wanted you to, just from your point of view, in terms of policy, like how do we take that next step? Like we have the UN resolution now. How do we now incorporate it into, or what would be your advice in leaders in many African nations incorporating that into our policies and law, to make that happen? And how do we, run with it? Because in my studies, part of my dissertation topic is the challenges of inclusive education in Nigerian public schools. And this is me coming from my training as now that I'm getting into academia, my training in, words, definitions, and training as a sped teacher. It's like I have to, in my mind, walk my way back. Okay, well, how can we actually implement this? Because in the US, they have, IDEA, and these things happen from the civil rights movement and on and on and on. And we also have, the convention of, human rights with, the UN and things like that. So how do countries implement this into law as much as you can say? Because it's really such a mountain, I feel sometimes, that we're climbing, and I have to just take it one step at a time when I think about the scope of it. But what would be your perspective in the best way to really implement that with African nations?
I mean, again, it's a very difficult question
Yeah.
because there's no one
Yes.
answer to it. It's
Right.
context specific.
Mhm.
In some countries, a lot more work has been done than others. So with albinism in Tanzania, there's been a huge amount of international attention focused on Tanzania, which has encouraged the successive governments to pay attention to this issue and to dedicate resource and time and energy to it, to look at the laws that are in place and to actually put policies together that now mean that people with albinism are represented nationally on the government, for example, to put in place a national policy on albinism, and to support the work of NGOs that are already working there to facilitate their work. So that's a very different context to, gosh, let's take Malawi, which is, incredibly different. A lot of attacks are happening still in Malawi at the moment. There's a very active group of NGOs who are working there, but at government level, there's relatively little being done still. So there's a lot more lobbying, activism, advocacy that's needed there. And I think, the legal system will need to be addressing this issue from the perspective of which laws are already there, which are needed, and what do we need to do about that. And I think a major coup for albinism actually has been having a UN independent expert on albinism. This is a figurehead who has been able to draw attention, to rally support internationally on these issues, and that's really, really made a big change in the last 5 to 7 years.
That's huge. I mean, I couldn't say it enough that what you did and your team of people, I think was the Wellcome Trust funding and the Knowledge Exchange Fellowship that really helped with the Human Rights Council and the resolution. It's so huge because I can only imagine from my little knowledge that I'm researching now, it took years to get to that point. And like you said, it'll probably take more years. So the question is, what could we do in the time being? And, I like that you are really pushing on how to, to address and to speak and to make people with albinism, make them the humans that they are versus their disability, and anybody with a disability, actually. And we know that the International Day for, persons with disabilities is coming up, and, that's our day to really, amplify just the change that you have done, which I'm so grateful to even just be talking to you and being your presence, and being passionate about helping people with albinism. So my last question, and this is what I always ask people in terms of your research, is what can we do now, just or what can you say to parents, who have children with albinism, or individuals who are adults and may not have had, the best experiences with, family or friends or their community? Like, what can you say to them to just be a word of encouragement, to be a light, and just a positive word for them, during this time?
Yeah. Well, I would say that families and communities are the biggest advocates for people with albinism. And actually, people with albinism are important advocates for the community. So I would just say continue to advocate, take every opportunity to do this. As you'll all know only too well, every little effort is important in bringing about a change to improve the lives of people with albinism and to ensure that they can fulfill their potential like any other individual on this planet. And I think whether that's challenging someone on the language they use or on their attitude or in the face of discrimination, I think we all have to take that on in our daily lives if we're going to ever change anything.
Wow. I want to say thank you. I know we definitely made it work at the end of the podcast. And on a very lighter note, I love to talk to people who've been to Africa. And I like that you said you went to Cameroon. So I have 2 bonus questions I was going to ask you, right?
Okay.
So in your visits to many parts of Africa, or maybe Cameroon, wherever you see fit, what is your favorite food that you've eaten in wherever part of Africa? And what is your favorite place that you visited? And would you recommend it to someone who wanted to go to a part of Africa for the first time?
Okay, well, I would say my favorite food has to be plantain, and I will even buy it in this country, but it never tastes the same.
I love you already, because that is my favorite. Oh my goodness.
And fish as well. I mean, the fresh fish that you can get is brilliant. So that's always amazing. But I have tried foods there that I would never have eaten here, just because they've been given, and I felt, I have to eat them because, someone's gone out and taken a lot of trouble to prepare the food. So I will eat things that, like snails, for example, I've had, which was interesting. But yeah, in terms of places, it's interesting because the first part of your question, my immediate response was Lagos, because it's the most incredible place I've ever been in my life. The most frightening. I mean, I was fairly young. It was one of my first experience. Well, it was my first time on the continent.
Lagos is a lot. Lagos is a lot.
Yeah, it was overwhelming. So we spent a week there, and then we went up to sort of Abeokuta and that way, which was a lot more manageable. But in terms of places to visit, it's probably not best for a first experience. But it didn't put me off. So.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I love it. I know I went to school and actually lived in Lagos for most of my life, and then I came to the US, and it's developed so much. I mean, they have so many Western things now. I have a friend who just hopped on a plane and she just went, and I think she had a friend who went to high school with her and she went.
Yeah, I need to go back. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. If you have someone to go with you, I think it might be less intimidating, but it's a business, fast-paced hub.
It's incredible. It really is.
I love that you have really touched ground in many parts of Africa, and you're doing such great work. And I really appreciate you being the expertise, and I appreciate the connections and the people that you have worked with to really shine a light on human rights issues, and just treating people with albinism like they're people, and really giving a lot of practical solutions to even a special education teacher or a general education teacher, a mainstream teacher in Africa who might be wondering how to include a student with disabilities into their schools. That's where my passion lies, is we have to find a way to get these kids in school, because education should be for everybody, and nobody should be turned away just because of a disability in any part of the world, but I think I'll just start with Africa now and go from there. So Dr. Baker, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you for what you've done in this field, and I can't wait to do more work with you in the future. So
thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast this week. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so on our website at www.ijpopoola.com. Or if you want to write to us about topics you would love to hear covered on the show, the email address is popoloijelma@gmail.com, one word. And if you'd like to follow us on our social media pages, it's at Miss IJ's Kids. I am IJ Popoola, and you've listened to Miss IJ's Kids Inclusive Podcast.